The first thrust of Plan Blue would be spearheaded by the 4th Panzer Army. Between Kursk and Oriol, General Hermann Hoth commanded the 4th Panzer Army, tasked with launching the drive towards Voronezh in the Upper Don. The 4th Panzer Army was comprised of 11 divisions, including 3 armored and 2 mechanized divisions. By reinforcing it with unmechanized infantry divisions, its strength was increased, albeit at the cost of speed and mobility. Supporting the 4th Panzer Army was Army Group Weichs, a German-Hungarian force led by General Maximilian von Weichs. This army group included his own 2nd Army, which he had commanded since 1940, and which now consisted of 1 motorized infantry division, 4 German divisions, and 2 Hungarian divisions. Additionally, the Hungarian 2nd Army was part of the Weichs group, featuring 4 Hungarian divisions. Facing these forces was the Soviet Bryansk Front, under the command of General Philip Golikov. The Bryansk Front was the strongest of the 3 fronts, and comprised 4 armies. Though relatively small in number, these forces were fresh, well-equipped, and had recently been reinforced by the 5th Tank Army in response to concerns about a potential attack in this sector. South of Kursk, the German 6th Army was assembling in the region between Kharkov and Belgorod. General Friedrich Paulus commanded the 6th Army, which had been substantially reinforced in preparation for Operation Blue. For the advance towards the Middle Don, Paulus had at his disposal 18 divisions, including 2 armored divisions and 1 mechanized division. Most of these divisions were veteran formations, and amongst the best in the German order of battle. Facing 6th Army was the Soviet Southwest Front. While the Southern Front was still under the command of Marshal Timoshenko, it had not yet recovered from the spring disasters and offered him little hope of a quick return to favor. Timoshenko's front included 5 armies, but they were all fatigued, weakened, and demoralized from their earlier failures outside of Kharkov. In the southern sector, General Paul Ewald von Kleist led the 1st Panzer Army, spearheading the attack across the Donets and Don rivers towards the Caucasus. The 1st Panzer Army consisted of 16 divisions, with most of them being unmechanized infantry, including 4 Romanian divisions. Supporting the 1st Panzer Army, under the command of General Richard Ruoff, was the 17th Army. This army had an additional 12 divisions, including 4 Romanian ones, again reflecting the dispersion of armored and mechanized units along the front. The Italian 8th Army, comprising 6 poorly equipped and unreliable divisions, served as the reserve. The Soviet Southern Front, led by General Rodion Malinowski, was responsible for defending the lower Donets and Don rivers. The Southern Front also included 5 armies, but it had suffered from heavy losses in the battle for Kharkov and remained below its establishment in terms of equipment and personnel. Disparities on the ground were mirrored by significant disparities in the air. In preparation for Operation Blue, the Germans concentrated most of their available aircraft in the southern theater, placing them under the operational command of the 4th Air Fleet. This would give them a high degree of coordination and concentration in the target sector. Lacking reliable intelligence of German intentions, the Red Army Air Force was more evenly deployed and grouped in a series of commands, loosely tied to the army fronts. Although technical improvements and mass production had at last given it a fighting chance against the Luftwaffe, its command structure remained awkward and its pilots still lacked confidence and skills. In many respects, Hitler's confidence in Operation Blue was not entirely without merit. He had superior forces in the south and still maintained the element of surprise. However, he had now committed almost all of his reserves. Far to the east, beyond the range of German reconnaissance, an additional 10 Soviet armies were being assembled. These forces would only be deployed as the crisis developed. Early on the morning of June 28th, mass concentrations of German artillery signaled the start of Operation Blue. Along the northern sector of the front, artillery guns roared while waves of aircraft flew overhead, executing carefully planned missions with precise targets. The Germans launched fierce attacks on airfields, communication centers, strategic towns, and military strongholds. Soviet reconnaissance aircraft were ruthlessly hunted down, eventually leaving the skies devoid of Soviet reconnaissance. A sense of shock and confusion gripped at the Bryansk front. In the sectors commanded by the 13th and 40 armies, German infantry and tanks were breaching the forward defenses, posing a threat to dislocate Golikov's left flank and disrupt the junction between the Bryansk and Southwest fronts. By mid-morning, it became evident that this was a major operation, and dangerous gaps were emerging in the front line. While the 4th Panzer Army and its supporting infantry armies were cutting back into the Bryansk front, The second phase of Operation Blue was launched against Timoshenko's southwest front. Again, German infantry and armor crashed into 21st Army, further threatening the already perilously weak junction between Timoshenko's 21st and Golukov's 40th. Soon, the whole front was in motion. In early July, 1st Panzer and 17th Army jumped off from their start lines west of the Donets. Everywhere, the Russians fell back under the weight of the onslaught. By July 5th, forward elements of the 4th Panzer Army had reached the Don River near Voronezh and began advancing through the western suburbs of the city. Between Bryansk and the southwest fronts, there was now a gap over 150 miles wide, through which German second echelon formations were pouring. For the first time in the war, the Russians were not desperately trying to hold hopelessly exposed positions but were retreating in a relatively organized manner. German forces were closing in on stragglers and rear guards. But these were not the grand encirclements that Hitler had envisioned or that characterized previous German offenses. Despite the lack of a significant catch, Hitler believed that the Red Army was on the brink of collapse. Other assessments, however, suggested that the Red Army was learning how to fight a modern war. In Voronezh, remnants of the 40th Army put up a resistance for several days, and the hastily mobilized 5th Tank Army launched desperate attacks on the flanks of the 4th Panzer advance. While these attacks were ultimately futile, they bought crucial time for Timoshenko. He was able to pull back the battered armies of the southwest front to the Don River's line and deploy the first reserve armies into the battle. In the south, fighting for Rostov and the Don River crossings was even more intense. Malinovsky, aware of Timoshenko's setbacks and fearing that his southern front would be enveloped from the north, conducted a skillful rearguard action while his armies escaped to the south. Angered by these delays and believing that the Soviet center had fallen apart, Hitler now made the first of a series of fundamental alterations to the plan. 4th Panzer was detached from the 6th Army, along with 6 armies on integral armored spearhead and sent south to assist 1st Panzer force a crossing of the lower Don. This diversion reduced 6th Army to a march, and further enabled the Russians to consolidate their positions along the line of the Don and in the Don Bend. The decision to change their focus was particularly noteworthy because the Don Steppe offered ideal tank terrain, unlike the challenging landscapes of the lower Don and the Caucasus. By this point, both sides had restructured their forces and adjusted their objectives. The overwieldy German Army Group South had been replaced by 2 smaller army groups. Army Group A consisted of both Panzer armies and the 17th Army, while Army Group B consisted of the 2nd Army, the 6th Army, minus its Panzer arm, the Hungarian 2nd Army, and the Italian 8th Army. This division of force signaled a strategic change of direction. Of the 16 armored and mechanized divisions in the field, Army Group A retained 15, while Army Group B was left virtually devoid of mobile forces and had an overly high number of Axis satellite divisions. Moreover, Army Group B had the challenging task of holding the Little Don River line, safeguarding Stalingrad on the Volga, and bearing the brunt of any potential Soviet counteroffensive. This was in contrast to the 3 mainly German armies of the Army Group A, which were advancing through the south into the Caucasus. Facing these forces were 4 Soviet fronts. The Bryansk front, reduced on its left wing, maintained its position east of Oryol. Positioned east from Voronezh, and guarding the northern part of the Don Bend, was the Voronezh front, which had been reinforced by 2 reserve armies during the intense battle for the city. In the Bend itself, and standing directly in the path of German Army Group B, a new front was being formed. The Stalingrad front comprised 3 reserve armies along with surviving elements of Timoshenko's southwest front. The Stalingrad front was charged with the defense of the Don Bend and the approaches to the Volga. On the lower Don and facing the full weight of Army Group A, the southern front was in the process of disengaging in preparation for a full-scale retreat. As the 4th Panzer approached the Don east of Rostov, the battle for the city was reaching its concluding phases. Barricades were erected throughout the city, and the Don River bridges were rigged for demolition. Soviet rear guards were positioned at every street corner, creating a unique challenge for the advancing Germans. This fighting retreat differed significantly from previous encounters during the German advance in Russia. It was a well-organized defense executed with skill and determination. Ultimately, Rostov fell to the Germans on July 23rd, allowing the core units of the southern front to escape to the south and east. With the Don crossing secured and the 6th Army's advance in the eastward sector slowing down due to the oppressive summer heat, Hitler adjusted his plans once again. He detached 2 armored and 3 mechanized divisions from the 4th Panzer to reinforce Paulus in the Don Bend. Simultaneously, he ordered the remaining infantry elements of 4th Panzer, along with its sole remaining armored division, to shift their focus northeastward and launch an attack across the Don Steppe towards the Volga. While panzer units raced back and forth across the steppe, and German infantry troops marched and fought on the plains of southern Russia, Soviet forces in the Don Bend were strengthening their positions and preparing their defenses. Unbeknownst to Hitler, Stalin had issued orders to halt any further retreat in the east. The Red Army was to stand and fight. It fell back from the Don, it would not fall back beyond the Volga. In late July, 6th Army resumed its offensive in the Don Bend. Armored spearheads were driven into the flanks of the Soviet front, while the infantry maintained steady pressure in the center. In the northern sector, the attacks made good progress. Armored and mechanized units successfully penetrated the Russian defenses, cutting their way southeastward toward Kalak. Meanwhile, in the lower Don region, the southern pincer of the 6th Army launched a powerful assault against the junction of the 62nd and 64th Soviet armies. The fighting in the Don Bend continued relentlessly during the first 3 weeks of August. As the 6th Army advanced eastward, 4th Panzer made steady progress northward, pushing the front lines back towards the narrow strip of land between the Don and the Volga rivers. In early August, Stalin made another adjustment to the command structure in the southern theater of operations. The Stalingrad front was reduced from 6 armies to 4, with 2 of these, the 38th and 28th armies, being reinforced from the armored reserve and designated as tank armies. Additionally, the newly formed Southeast Front comprised 4 armies and was positioned directly in the path of not only the 6th Army, but also the 4th Panzer Army. By August 10th, General Paulus had largely completed the clearance of the Don Bend region directly west of Stalingrad. However, in the northern sector, the Russians still maintained control over several significant positions on the western bank of the Don River. These stubbornly defended positions proved extremely difficult to eliminate, causing further delays in Paulus's eastward advance. For Hitler, the campaign to reach the Volga was proving to be a much lengthier endeavor than he had initially anticipated, and was becoming a cause for serious concern amongst the German high command. In contrast, the progress of German Army Group A was startling. After jumping off from its bridgeheads on the lower Don on July the 25th, it had fanned out on a broad front. While the 17th Army veered westward toward the Black Sea, the 1st Panzer Army launched an attack in the south and east, swiftly advancing through territory largely abandoned by Russian forces. On August 9th, the leading units of the 1st Panzer Army reached the northern foothills of the Caucasus, covering a distance of over 300 miles. Meanwhile, in the Don Bend region, intense activity was unfolding. As the conflict persisted in the north, German assault units readied themselves to launch an offensive across the river at its closest point to the Volga. Initially scheduled for August 19th, the operation faced a 2-day delay and eventually commenced on August 21st, extending across a front spanning roughly 20 miles. By the following morning, 22 pontoon bridges had been assembled over the Don River, allowing German infantry and armored forces to resume their eastward advance. The push toward Volga was led by the 16th Panzer Division, with support from 2 motorized infantry divisions. On August 23rd, they launched their attack in the echelon from the Don bridgehead, rapidly covering the remaining 36 miles of the open steppe. This style of warfare played to the strengths of the Wehrmacht, as they bypassed strong defensive positions or addressed them with mobile assault groups breaking away from the main thrust. Had these tactics been employed in mid-July, Stalingrad would have been taken off the march. In late August, when the strategic aims of Blue had become transparently clear, and the Soviet High Command had recovered from its initial shock, they carried a serious element of risk. While Paulus's armored spearhead hurtled east over the broad flat plains, the full weight of the 4th Air Fleet was unleashed on Stalingrad. Massed formations of German bombers laid down a carpet of destruction. Firestorms swept through the wooden suburbs, claiming the lives of 40,000 people in just one day. The docks, administrative center, and extensive portions of the city's industrial core were reduced to ruins. Enormous columns of smoke hung in the sky, visible for miles around. Later that same day, the vanguard units of the 16th Panzer Division reached the Volga River, situated north of Stalingrad. While making their advance towards the Volga, the 16th Panzer Division had severed the southeast front from the Stalingrad front. But this move left them dangerously exposed. Following in their wake, the motorized infantry units encountered increasingly fierce resistance and struggled to keep the pace with the armored forces. With their backs against the Volga and dwindling supplies of fuel and ammunition, the 16th Panzer Division found themselves isolated. While the supporting infantry fought to break through and reinforce them, the 16th Panzer Division faced relentless Soviet counterattacks from the north and south. For 6 days, they clung tenaciously to their positions along the Volga, targeting river traffic with their artillery and launching sporadic assaults through the sprawling northern suburbs of Stalingrad. Above, the Luftwaffe continued its devastating campaign. Thousands of sorties were flown over the belligerent city, overwhelming the anti-aircraft defenses and driving Soviet fighters from the skies. With inexorable determination, Stalingrad on the Volga, once a renowned bastion to the Tsars and a gateway to Asia, was gradually reduced to a pile of rubble. Towards the end of August, the Soviet armies of the Southeast Front were being pressed relentlessly from the south and west. Between the Don and the Volga, a huge salient was formed by the northerly thrust of the 4th Panzer Army and the continuing pressure of the 6th Army's infantry. The Soviet left flank was held by the 57th and 51st Armies, and was safely anchored along a line of saltwater lakes. But the 62nd, and to an even greater extent the 64th, held dangerously exposed positions in the salient. On August the 29th, 4th Panzer mounted a major offensive through the center of the salient towards Stalingrad. The attack sliced into the rear of the 64th Army, threatening it and part of the 62nd with encirclement. 6th Army was ordered to detach mobile forces from the Volga corridor and strike quickly south to join up with the 4th Panzer spearhead. But the corridor was only just holding a subject to increasingly frantic attacks by the 4th Tank Army. The pressure in the north tied up 6th Army's mobile formations for 3 vital days, enabling the Soviet forces in the salient to conduct a fighting retreat, escaping eastward to the inner defense lines west of the Volga. Once again, the Germans had failed to achieve a major encirclement, further prolonging the campaign and ensuring that the fight for the city would be long and hard. At the end of August, General Zhukov assumed overall command of the Soviet forces in the south. Zhukov's task was to coordinate the various front commands, organize the defense of Stalingrad, and maintain pressure on the 6th Army's vulnerable left flank. In early September, while the German ring closed around the city, Zhukov mounted a series of offensives from the north. Though failing to break through the German cordon, the attacks helped to hinder the 6th Army's advance by diverting attention and forces from the center to the periphery. Meanwhile, Soviet reserves continued to flow south, some to reinforce the 62nd Army in Stalingrad, but many more to bolster the flanks and provide Zhukov with the necessary strength and flexibility to mount local counterattacks. In mid-September, Soviet pressure in the north eased off enough to allow Paulus to resume his efforts in Stalingrad. The city was now surrounded on 3 sides, and the Volga crossings were under fire from German artillery. On the 13th, the Germans attacked through the southern suburbs, edging forward under cover of airstrikes and supported by tanks and artillery. The objective was the main landing stage, handling ferry traffic from the east bank. Initially, the attacks made good ground. But as the Germans advanced, Soviet resistance began to intensify. Amid the ruins of the center city, they soon became bogged down in the vicious street fighting. General Chukov, commanding 62nd Army, reorganized and rallied the defenders, creating a series of mini-fortresses and funneling the Germans into killing zones. These were carefully mapped out, ringed with anti-tank weapons and precisely targeted by artillery batteries situated on the far shore. Gradually, the Germans fought their way forward, pressing in now from the north as well as the south. Some isolated strong points held out for days. Others changed hands several times. Often, the front line was no more than an interior wall, or the floor space separating different levels in the same building. Gains were measured in yards, weighed against the cost and casualties, and held onto desperately in the face of almost suicidal Soviet counterattacks. Overhead, clouds of bombers continued to pulverize what remained of the Soviet rear. Hardly a single building now remained intact. The landing areas were clogged with corpses, and the river channels with the hulks of burning ferries. Yet somehow or other, in small groups, Soviet reinforcements continued to get through. Those that reached the front were already veterans, survivors from the grim and perilous journey across the Volga. Stalingrad had become a place of horror, a vortex of fire and noise. The cacophony of small arms fire echoed ceaselessly, interrupted by the thunderous rumble of artillery, the shrill whine and thud of ordnance, and the deafening explosions of bombs. The combat grew increasingly fierce, intimate, and brutal. Even the city's drains and sewers became battlegrounds for intense skirmishes between heavily armed infiltration groups. In a series of such ruthless confrontations, impulsive assaults, and slow, grinding offensives, the German forces gradually advanced through the city's heart, inching closer to the Volga River. By the end of September, the Germans shifted their primary focus from the southern and central sectors of Stalingrad to the northern factory district. 3 imposing complexes dominated the skyline: the Red October, barricades, and tractor factories. These colossal concrete fortresses rose from a sea of rubble, with many of their workshops still churning out tanks, guns, and ammunition for the front lines. With the primary landing stage and much of the city center now under German control, these strongholds represented the last significant pockets of Soviet resistance. On October 3rd, the Germans launched an assault with 5 divisions along a 3-mile front. Tanks plowed over towering mounds of debris, engaging in close-quarters combat along streets choked with rubble. Following behind, infantry advanced cautiously, clearly aware of the hidden dangers lurking within the shadows of the shattered buildings. As it had in the south, the Germans' offensive in the north soon began to flag. The Russians contested every foot of ground, every floor and workshop. Factory workers and soldiers fought side by side. No quarter was given and no prisoners taken. For the Russian soldiers, now fighting with their backs to the Volga, there was no possibility of retreat left. Both sides brought in fresh reserves, and the battle raged fiercely amidst the craters and ruins. On October 14th, in a bid to maintain the momentum of the attack, Paulus committed the remaining reserves, pushing to within a few hundred yards of the Volga. The Germans now controlled 90% of the city, but the Russians clung to a fragile bridgehead, seemingly willing to sacrifice their lives to hold it. Paulus's troops were now not only physically exhausted, but faced with more pressing concerns. To achieve even this partial victory, he had, in the preceding weeks, stripped his flanks of nearly all their combat forces. He had also misled Hitler, greatly exaggerating the size of the Soviet force in Stalingrad, and reports were now coming in of significant Soviet troop concentrations on the flanks. Adding to the challenges, the first frost of winter had arrived earlier than anticipated. Biting cold winds blew in from the east, and snowflakes began to pepper the landscape of rubble, charred timbers, and the gray uniforms of his soldiers. Far to the south, the advance of German Army Group A had also ground to a halt, failing to fulfill its early promise. When Kleist's 1st Panzer Army reached Maykop, the oil fields were in flames, and the scale of destruction was so extensive that it would take a year's effort to restore them to operation. The remaining oil-producing areas lay south of the Caucasus, a 700-mile-long chain of untamed mountains stretching from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea, and crowned by the 18,000-foot-high peak of Mount Elbrus. There were few passes, and those that existed were high, tortuous, and easy to defend. Throughout August and September, German mountain troops had probed for a way through. As October arrived and the onset of winter rendered further attempts futile, the German forces remained far from achieving their objectives. While the 62nd Army continued to draw the Germans deeper into the Stalingrad cauldron, Zhukov was secretly amassing forces in preparation for his own offensive. Initially conceived as a response to Stalin's persistent calls for diversionary attacks against the flanks of the Sixth Army, the plan extended in scope and ambition as the battle for the city intensified and the flanks of the German forces became increasingly strained. To prepare for the launch of the offensive, the Soviet fronts underwent a reorganization. The old Stalingrad front was replaced with 2 new fronts, the Southwest Front and the Don Front. Simultaneously, the Southeast Front was renamed as the Stalingrad Front. The offensive was scheduled to unfold in 2 stages. In the first stage, the Soviet armies of the Southwest Front would launch an attack from the Don bridgeheads, driving south and east through the Don Bend toward the town of Kalach. In the second stage, timed for the following day, heavily reinforced formations positioned on the left wing of the Stalingrad front would launch an attack westward toward the Don, with the overarching goal of encircling the bulk of the German forces besieging Stalingrad. While the Soviet pincers cut through the German rear, the armies of the Don front, and even those on the battered right wing of the Stalingrad front, would continue to apply pressure in the center. Although ambitious, the plan was fundamentally sound, taking advantage of the increasing overextension of Axis forces in the Stalingrad sector. Most of the German 6th Army and all of the 4th Panzer Army were now concentrated between the Don and the Volga, leaving the flanks weakly held by 4 unreliable and understrength Axis satellite armies. Of these, it was upon the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies that the main weight of the Soviet offensive would fall. Throughout October and early November, as the Russians completed their ground buildup, the Red Air Force gradually gained control of the skies. Initially, Soviet air operations in the Stalingrad sector were limited to nighttime or localized raids. However, with an increasing number of better aircraft becoming available, the defensive strategy was abandoned in favor of an all-out offensive approach. Aerial dominance in critical sectors of the battle zone was essential to ensure success on the ground. With over 1 million Russian soldiers poised to advance against the Axis lines, concealing the final deployments would be challenging. German reconnaissance efforts had to be thwarted, and as the offensive commenced, Soviet breakthrough forces would require effective fighter cover and tactical air support. On November 19th, at the Don River, the Soviet offensive began with concentrated artillery barrages targeting the Romanian positions facing the southwest front. The barrage proved devastating. In the days leading up to the offensive, thousands of guns, mortars, and Katyusha rocket launchers had been secretly assembled in narrow breakthrough sectors. In a crescendo of firepower, the Romanian lines were torn apart, trenches obliterated, and bunkers and pillboxes reduced to rubble. By midday, the Romanian 3rd Army had been pushed aside, and Soviet tanks and infantry swarmed over the plains. The following day marked the launch of the second stage of the offensive against the Romanian 4th Army in the Don-Volga Isthmus. Once again, the great swirling mass of Soviet armor and infantry overwhelmed the defense. Russian cavalry steamed through the gaps. Army Group B was in chaos. In all sectors, the pressure was intense. Attacks were launched against 6th Army's position in the Don Bend, against 4th Panzer to the south of Stalingrad, and out of the Stalingrad bridgehead itself. Surrounded on all sides and subjected to relentless air harassment, the German forces in the Stalingrad sector found themselves unable to react swiftly enough to halt the advancing tide. 3 days later, following a swift advance through the Don Bend, Soviet forces from the southwest front connected with those from the Stalingrad front, completing the encirclement of the formidable German 6th Army and most of the 4th Panzer Army. As the Russians urgently bolstered their encircling ring, the fighting with Stalingrad persisted. The 62nd Army under Chuikov, emboldened by reports of the disaster that had befallen the 6th Army, fought with renewed confidence and determination. Finally, there was not only hope for relief, but also for a heroic and decisive victory against overwhelming odds. On 3 occasions, while the opportunity still existed, Paulus sought permission to launch a breakout to the southwest. Each time, his request was denied by Hitler, who refused to entertain any withdrawal from the Volga. Stalingrad was to be transformed into a fortress, and until 6th Army could be relieved, it would rely on airlift for supplies. From the outset, the airlift support for 6th Army fell significantly short of even the most basic requirements. Of the 500 tons per day promised to Paulus, less than 100 tons were actually delivered. Stocks of food, ammunition, and fuel gradually diminished, leaving 6th Army increasingly immobile and vulnerable. Unless the situation improved, the 300,000 German and Romanian troops trapped in the pocket would be slowly starved into submission. At the end of November, Hitler created Army Group Don to hold the line between Army Groups A and B. Army Group Don, under the command of General Erich von Manstein, consisted of the 6th Army within the Stalingrad pocket. This now included the encirclement elements of the 4th Panzer Army, remnants of the 4th Romanian Army, and a reconstituted 4th Panzer Army hastily assembled from support units and fortified by 4 weaker panzer divisions. Manstein's plan aimed to launch an attack through the Don-Volga Isthmus, targeting the area where the Russian infantry was most vulnerable. This offensive was designed to facilitate the breakout of the 6th Army into the southwest. However, this plan faced 2 significant obstacles. The first was Hitler's adamant opposition to any withdrawal from the Volga. The second, unbeknownst to Manstein, was the Soviet preparation for their first own offensive. The Soviet offensive would be executed by the Voronezh and southwest fronts, targeting the Italian 8th Army on the right flank of Army Group B. The objective was to sever all German forces south of the Don River. Meanwhile, the Don and Stalingrad fronts would continue to exert pressure on the 6th Army within the Stalingrad pocket and repel any attempts at relief. Despite careful planning and tactical support from the Luftwaffe, Manstein's relief offensive had limited prospects for success. With only 2 armored divisions dedicated to the attack, there was no realistic chance of creating a permanent corridor across the 60 miles of snow-covered steppe to reach Stalingrad. At best, Manstein's forces could advance partially, disrupt the Soviet forces within the encirclement, and offer one final opportunity for the 6th Army to attempt a breakout. Inevitably, on December the 19th, after a week of heavy fighting, the relief offensive was finally brought to a halt along the line of the Volga River, barely halfway to Stalingrad. For a further 5 days, the Germans held these positions in the forlorn hope that Paulus would defy Hitler's express command and order the 6th Army to attempt a breakout. For Army Group Dawn, the situation grew increasingly dire with each passing day. On December 16th, the Russians swiftly penetrated the Italian 8th Army, devastating 5 of its divisions and plunging the rest into chaos. A dangerous gap, approximately 90 miles wide, had now been opened between Army Groups B and Don. By Christmas Eve, the relief forces stationed in the Don-Volga Isthmus started withdrawing from their advanced positions along the Volga River. At the same time, Army Group A was covertly preparing to abandon the Caucasus region. The fate of the 6th Army had become inevitable. Throughout January 1943, the Russians continued to tighten the encirclement around the 6th Army while simultaneously pushing westward across the Don and the Donets River toward Rostov. On January 12th, a significant Soviet offensive struck the Hungarian 2nd Army in the Upper Don region, effectively completing the destruction of Axis satellite armies in Russia. As Soviet armor units advanced through the Donets corridor toward Kharkov, the Germans scrambled desperately to close the gaps and stabilize the front line. All the gains made during Operation Blue were rapidly abandoned. Only the 6th Army remained in its position, but it was completely encircled and increasingly isolated within the ruins of Stalingrad. The final phase of the Russian assault on the 6th Army commenced on January 22nd. By now, the Stalingrad pocket had been reduced to a third of its original size, and the 6th Army was separated from Army Group Don by 160 miles of steppe. That day, the Russians overran the last serviceable airfield available to Paulus. For 10 more days, the survivors of the 6th Army fought on the limits of their strength and endurance. Soviet attacks on road from every direction. On January the 25th, Russian troops advanced from the west, linked up with units of the 62nd Army in the Volga bridgehead. 6th Army was now cut in half and reduced to fighting for a few square miles of frozen rubble. On January the 31st, the Battle of Stalingrad ended for General Paulus, only that day promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler. He had, as he had been ordered, held out until the last possible moment, surrendering only when the Russians reached to the door of his headquarters. The capitulation of Paulus brought the fighting in the southern enclave to an end. But in the northern enclave, the killing went for a further 2 days. The last pockets of resistance in the north were not liquidated until February the 2nd, and only then, at the cost of several thousand more lives. Those who emerged from the ruins of the factory district had fought on relentlessly, without hope, until they exhausted their ammunition and strength. They were weary, on the brink of starvation, and many suffered from untreated wounds or frostbite. Yet, they harbored few illusions about their fate. In Stalingrad, the war had descended to new depths of squalor. Men had been sent into the slaughter with seemingly little regard for their lives. Many had become hardened and indifferent to the suffering of others. On both sides, the killing of prisoners had become a common practice, and for the survivors of the 6th Army, the ordeal was far from over. Out of the 110,000 German soldiers taken prisoner by the Russians, including 24 generals, only 5,000 would ever return to Germany. The defeat at Stalingrad was a catastrophic blow to the Wehrmacht. 20 German divisions were erased from the order of battle, and many more were severely weakened. The 6th Army was utterly annihilated, along with 6 months' worth of the Reich's war production. Furthermore, the armies of Italy, Hungary, and Romania were either demolished or routed from the battlefield, while all the lands to the east and south of the Don River fell into Russian hands. To the west of the Don, the German retreat continued into the early months of 1943. Army Group A was withdrawn from the Caucasus, and Army Group B fell back across the Donets. Kharkov was abandoned and then recaptured in a brilliantly executed counteroffensive, but this marked the Wehrmacht's last significant victory in the east. The losses sustained during Operation Blue had been devastating and could never be fully replenished. In the months and years ahead, the German military found itself increasingly isolated, abandoned one by its Axis partners, and facing a resurgent Red Army that had gained fresh reserves of strength from its victory in Stalingrad.
For decades, numerous historians have studied the Luftwaffe and its failures during the Second World War. What caused an air force that was in many ways vastly superior to the Allies to come crashing down? Is there a distinct turning point that made Germany's aerial arsenal impotent against the combined strength of Britain, America, and the Soviet Union? For the first time ever, put yourself right in the middle of the debate as we try to solve the greatest arguments in the history of aviation. What caused the Luftwaffe to fail? In 1933, Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany and later the Führer, enacting complete control over the fatherland. Eager to reclaim the lost territories taken from Germany after the Treaty of Versailles, the Nazi war machine realizes early on that the formation of a strong air force is vital. In 1935, it becomes official on paper, and the Luftwaffe is born. The man put in charge of this department is Hermann Göring, a prominent ace from the Great War.
Goering was a World War I fighter pilot. He was not interested in technology. He said something at one point, he said, well, this device is a box with coils, and I don't like boxes with coils. He still had this sort of, well, if you're courageous and brave, you don't have to worry about technological gizmos.
In building this new air force, the Nazis possess many advantages that other nations do not, including a first-class aircraft industry, symbolized by the names Messerschmitt, Dornier, Heinkel, Junkers, and Focke-Wulf. Brilliant engineers capable of taking aerodynamics to a whole new level, and a highly educated population that can build aircraft on a mass scale. By 1938, production rises to over 5,000 planes. 1 year later, that figure soars to over 8,000, a testament to the importance Nazis place on the doctrine of air power.
What the Germans were trying to do was to employ new machines, new technologies, but to employ them in the service of a very, very old way of war that had served them well in previous conflicts and they felt would continue to serve them well in the future. I think this sets the Germans somewhat apart from neighboring countries in the 1920s and 1930s in that they are not truly looking ahead as much as they are looking back to their old traditions and grafting new technologies onto them.
Before war is declared in August of 1939, Germany's aerial arsenal is impressive to say the least. Ready to go is the Me-109, a superior single-engine fighter, the Junkers 87 Stuka, a terrifying dive bomber, the Heinkel 111 and the Dornier 17 Flying Pencil, two top-of-the-line medium-range bombers. This, in addition to the largest air transport industry in the entire world, exemplified by the Junkers 52, a workhorse that will be at the centerpiece of the German offensive. Even with all these phenomenal aircraft, a key ingredient is missing, as is often noted by Second World War historians: the absence of strategic bombers. This void does not go unnoticed in 1935, when General Walter Wever, realizing their importance, enthusiastically supports the building of long-range aircraft to battle any potential enemy, most likely the Soviet Union.
General Walter Wever was promoting what he called the Urals bomber. He believed that the industrialization, tanks, planes, etc., that was going on in the Urals area had to be demolished if you were going to win a war against Russia.
Wever writes, Air power carries the war right into the heart of enemy country from the moment war breaks out. It strikes at the very root of the enemy's fighting power and of the people's will to resist.
Yeah, Walter Weber was very much in favour of this long-distance bomber to try and bomb Russia, and that actual project was given the name of the Ural bomber. Weber actually then put specifications out to both Dornier and Junkers for the building of this long-range bomber. Out of this came the Dornier 19 and the Junkers 89. But neither of these aircraft had the performance that was currently available in the United States of the B-17 Flying Fortress. So therefore, neither of those airplanes really progressed very far beyond a couple of prototypes.
Dying due to a plane crash in 1936, his doctrine epitomized by the Dornier 19 and the Junkers 89 are scrapped by Goering.
Goering, I think, didn't go along with this because he rather took the view that Hitler had, that they could win by blitzkrieg, and they wouldn't be required to get into this lengthy process of using heavy bombers.
Inquiring as to how many twin-engine planes can be made for every 4-engine one, the answer given to him is 2.5. The Field Marshal's response is that the Führer does not ask me how big my bombers are, but how many there are. It is important to note that the decision not to build long-range bombers cannot be considered a failure. For Germany, the raw materials needed to build such planes would require large amounts of rubber, metals and fuel, all of which would have to be imported for a hefty price. Of the 4,500 tons of aluminium needed per month for aircraft production, only half is available during the Weber era. The Air Force that he and others envisioned was simply uneconomic at the time. What truly represented the German way of war is instead a tactical Air Force.
The German War of Movement attempted to defeat as much of the enemy army as possible within the opening weeks of fighting. So the tactical level of fighting for an individual position, and then the operational level of attempting to defeat an enemy army. But arguably, Germany had never been very good, and this would go back to Prussia before it, at the kind of long-term strategic planning that the Allies were so skilled at in World War II. Arguably, this was because the Germans felt they had to win all their wars quickly or they would not win them at all, and that attempting to play strategic warfare with the vast economic and industrial resources of the United States was a losing game from the start.
Working closely with those on the ground, the Luftwaffe is wildly successful as the Second World War begins. Poland is easily demolished. Norway is taken away from the British effortlessly. The Low Countries and even the power of France cannot resist German might during the year 1940. It appears that nothing can stop Nazi forces from gobbling up the continent of Europe.
Certainly the Luftwaffe played an extremely important part in the opening German victories of World War II. And when we say opening victories, we don't mean the first 6 months, we mean the first 2 years, in which it looked like a German victory was very much in the offing. The German Air Force was very skilled at the tactical level, that is, cooperation with the ground forces. It was extremely successful at the operational level of war, the intermediate level, that is, carrying out campaigns against enemy supply lines, for example, feeding troops and men to the front.
With the fall of France, Britain is the only nation standing in the way of this German juggernaut. In order to finish off the rebellious island nation, a plan known as Operation Sea Lion is approved. It calls for the Luftwaffe to achieve air superiority over the English Channel. Once this is completed, German forces will be deployed onto British soil. However, during this pivotal battle, the Luftwaffe is dealt its very first aerial defeat. Primarily through the use of Spitfires and Hurricanes, the English are able to push back German planes from the coast to Britannia. While this monumental struggle ensues, we discover one of the Luftwaffe's greatest failure, its lack of coordination with the Kriegsmarine.
Goering said, everything that flies is mine, and bitterly fought against any attempts by the German Navy to get a hold of a piece of the air action. When they wanted long-range aircraft assigned to them, Goering, actually, Dönitz went behind Goering's back directly to Hitler, and I think got a dozen of the Focke-Wulf Condors assigned to him. Goering, when he found out about this, was furious and actually cut off all cooperation with the Kriegsmarine at this point.
Despite pleas by Admiral Raeder to create a separate air force for the Navy, Goering refuses to give the green light to any potential inter-service rival. The roots for this conflict come from each service's desire to be recognized as the one who brought victory to the fatherland.
Of course, there has always been the rivalry between the Navy and the Air Force from the point of view that we refer to ourselves as the Imperial Navy and refer to the Air Force as the Nazi Air Force. So that differentiated us already in attitude and character.
In hindsight, Goering's decision proves fatal as Germany and Britain battle it out in both the skies and on the high seas. Winston Churchill would write that the greatest threat to Britain was the Battle of the Atlantic, where German U-boat submarines are enormously successful in sinking English shipping.
I think Churchill was quite correct that the Battle of the Atlantic was the one front where Britain could really lose the war because they were so dependent on supplies, even food, coming from North America, that if that lifeline was cut, Britain would have been really in dire straits.
With the defeat of France, bases are built right on their coast, giving these vessels an even bigger theatre to disrupt the lifeline of Britain. Had aerial forces worked closely with these U-boats, or if a separate naval aviation wing was created, it would be a game-changer in Germany's war against Britain. Proof of this can be seen in the Focke-Wulf 200 Condor, an aircraft that, despite its limitations, is excellent in attacking English ships. With no more than a dozen planes, they successfully sink 85 merchant vessels and over 300,000 tons of shipping.
When the Germans started to deploy a fairly small number of the Focke-Wulf 200 Condors to attack Allied shipping, they were able to have really a devastating effect.
Also, had the new invention of a magnetic mine been dropped by Luftwaffe planes into the English Channel, its enemy could have been starved out of the war. This marks the first major failure of the Luftwaffe.
It was our common complaint of us, the little people, let's say, that there was no coordination whatsoever between the German Navy and the German Air Force.
With a stalemate on the Western Front, Germany decides to keep the British at bay and instead focus attention on their ally, the Soviet Union. Enacting a war plan known as Operation Barbarossa, some 3 million Nazi soldiers equipped with rifles, tanks and planes begin the biggest land assault in history. Using less than 3,000 aircraft, a force smaller than that utilized in the battle against France, Germany is miraculously able to push back Soviet forces to the suburbs of Moscow. The decision to launch Operation Barbarossa exposes the Luftwaffe to its second major failure, the lack of maintenance and repair on the ground. When a German aircraft is damaged, it is sent back to the fatherland for repair. When fighting a relatively short and tactical war against France, this particular system works fairly well. When fighting a long, drawn-out war of attrition against the communists, however, it proves to be a gigantic blunder. In the Soviet Union, with the fighting taking place far away from the major cities of Germany, the time it takes engineers to repair a damaged aircraft and have it sent back to the front is enormous. And by 1941, less than 30% of the Luftwaffe's airfields are operational, a fact that is almost inconceivable when taken into account that Germany is fighting a two-front struggle. As Field Marshal Erhard Milch would reflect after the war, the vertical organization in 4 territorial determined Luftflotte commands was grossly inadequate for launching a war well beyond the borders of the Third Reich. The attack of June 22, 1941 would in retrospect be a catastrophic mistake. For those like Goering, men who had never fought on the Eastern Front during the First World War, they would grossly underestimate the Soviet will and the industrial capacity of a regime thought to be so backwards by Hitler. Moving its factories far beyond the Ural Mountains, they are out of range of German bombers. The ghost of General Wefer comes back to haunt the Luftwaffe. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Germany declares war against the United States. Before this decision is made, Hitler shrugs off any suggestion of a possible American threat in the form of an arsenal of democracy. In declaring war, Hitler foolishly adds yet another enemy to the Third Reich's list, one with a production capacity that is unparalleled. With two oceans separating America from the fighting, its people can go on producing without the threat of bombardment. Britain would have hauled the flag down long ago if it had not been for America's support, one Field Marshal said. With Germany by this time experiencing severe shortage of aluminium and copper, America is fully stocked of these and other vital raw materials. By 1944, the United States is able to churn out over 96,000 planes per year, one every 5 minutes, more than double that of the Germans. Before this catastrophic decision is made, it is important to note that by 1940, even Britain, with its shipping being torpedoed at an unprecedented rate, is outproducing Germany in aircraft. The British are able to improvise, and as a result produce outstanding planes like the de Havilland Mosquito, an aircraft made from plywood. In contrast, by 1941, with Nazi forces engaged in a two-front war, total production is just over 11,000 planes, a yearly increase of only 3,000 from when the war began. It is clear that the Third Reich's total output is only a fraction of what it could be.
One of the failures of the German Luftwaffe was their inability ever to work out a sane procurement and production process. Prototypes would be built and abandoned. They would be rebuilt and altered by Hitler's order and abandoned, and rebuilt a third time and perhaps put into production as an aircraft very, very different from what the original designers had intended.
This lack of planning and foresight can be attributed to the man who took control of Luftwaffe production in 1936, long before the war began. His name is Ernst Udet. An outstanding ace from the First World War, he is put in control by Goering, replacing Wilhelm Wimmer. His appointment to this powerful position marks the third, and possibly the greatest failure of the Luftwaffe.
Goering placed one of his World War I fighter ace buddies, Ernst Udet, in charge of technical developments. Udet really didn't know anything about this stuff.
Udet's forerunner Wimmer has been outstanding in overseeing the Luftwaffe's second-generation aircraft during the pre-war era, including the Me-109, the Junkers 87, and the Heinkel 111. With Udet as his replacement, however, the next line of aircraft is a far cry from their predecessors.
One of his hobby horses was dive bombers. He had seen, actually, in America, interestingly, between the wars, a demonstration of dive bombing, thought every German bomber should be made into a dive bomber, and then even ordered this new four-engine bomber, Heinkel 177, under development, to be made into a dive bomber. Well, Heinkel himself, who was, after all, an engineer who understood this, kept trying to talk him out of it, said this is ridiculous, but was overruled, and so they had to go back and strengthen the wings of the 177 to try to reduce drag so it could actually dive at high speeds. They tried mounting the engines in pairs instead of having four engines like you would normally think you would do on a bomber. They were mounted front and back in a single pod on each wing. This resulted in so much heat being generated that the engines were constantly overheating. So it really, I mean, it was a crazy idea, and it led directly to delays, and I guess you can really say the ultimate failure of Germany to field an effective four-engine bomber during the war.
The Heinkel 177, with its odd tandem engine arrangement and an insane requirement by Udet to dive bomb, makes this plane a complete disaster from start to finish. The aircraft becomes known as the dead racehorse, with only a handful ever getting the chance to fly.
The Heinkel 177 and the Me-210 go hand in hand as one of the Luftwaffe's major disasters.
The Messerschmitt 210, a replacement for the ME 110, is full of problems that are never ratified.
When he came up with his Messerschmitt 210, the RLF said, oh yes, that's very good, let's immediately, we'll order 10,000. Or whatever it was. But they went into mass production and the thing had hardly flown. It was a complete and utter disaster for Messerschmitt, which he'd never lived down, and they had to convert a lot of the built ME-210s into ME-410s by taking the aeroplanes to pieces again and reassembling them with new parts to turn it into a flyable and operational machine.
As one aircraft representative is overheard saying, everything turns to dust in Udet's hands. Only one aircraft, the Focke-Wulf 190, is considered a success under his watch. A reluctance to make the hard decisions also proves costly, as resources are diverted to projects that are simply unfeasible during wartime. By 1941, the need is for long-range strategic bombers, with America producing the B-17 Flying Fortress and the British reworking the Avro Manchester into the four-engine Avro Lancaster. Germany, in contrast, falls dramatically behind the Allies in producing four-engine bombers. Udet, with all his failures, commits suicide in 1941, leaving the Luftwaffe in shambles. With a Soviet victory at Stalingrad, German forces are pushed back, marking the beginning of the end. And as American and British bombers begin destroying German factories and city centers from the sky, the philosophy that General Weber endorsed years ago is coming true. Strategic bombing is proving vital in weakening the German war machine. Under the command of Field Marshal Erhard Milch, production is able to climb to 25,000 planes a year, a respectable increase, but nothing compared to what the Allies are able to produce.
U.S. procurement policies, which become a giant bureaucracy, embodied in the War Department and soon thereafter, World War II, embodied in the Pentagon. The Germans were simply not able to compete on that level.
In 1944, Germany is being outmaneuvered in the realm of aircraft by the rate of over 4-1. At this point, there is simply no way to compete with the United States or the Soviet Union. While much is written by historians about Allied coordination in resources and materials, little can be found about Germany's willingness to use its own allies' means of production to their advantage. This is yet another failure of the German Luftwaffe. Without a common goal and being on different sides of the world, the Empire of Japan cannot be considered Germany's biggest ally. Its most powerful friend during the war is instead the Italians. Unfortunately, with their own air force in shambles, the Nazis are reluctant to give them the licenses and the engines to build German planes on Italian soil. This proves to be a pivotal mistake, as Italy could have tripled aircraft production with German assistance, producing possibly 30,000 planes during the war. Also, Italian factories would have been out of bombing range for the Allies during the year 1942 and might have changed the outcome in the Mediterranean. Germany's other allies, Romania, Hungary and Finland, are all capable of making aircraft, but lack the knowledge and resources that the fatherland can provide. Had these nations been granted licenses to build Nazi aircraft on their own soil, there was a good chance that this coalition might have tipped the scale in favor of Germany during its pivotal battle against the Soviets during 1941. The decision not to fully utilize the resources of these nations can be attributed to Germany's desire to be the dominant power. There is widespread resentment against the Italians by top Nazi leaders who see them as merely riding off the coattails of German success.
Our feeling always was, with the experience of the First World War already, we wish the Italians were on the other side.
People like Hermann Goering see these smaller countries as the providers of natural resources, with the fatherland supplying the finished products. This marks another tragic failure of the Luftwaffe. In early 1944, Germany unveils the Messerschmitt 262, a revolutionary jet plane that can hopefully take down the flying fortresses and mosquitoes that are destroying their cities.
Later on, of course, they produced the world's first production model, general use jet aircraft in the form of the Messerschmitt 262, the Me-262. The Me-262 as a pure fighter was an amazing sight to see, and in fact, anyone looking at it today is still struck by the modern and sleek lines.
Now the Me-262 was, in my opinion, I've stated this many times, the most formidable aircraft of World War II.
The Me-262 is years ahead of its time, symbolizing the fatherland's creativity and innovation. In many ways, however, the Me-262 also symbolizes Nazi indecision.
Unfortunately, the Me-262 got caught in a very, very arcane and difficult procurement process within Germany, wherein basic designs were put forward by competent engineers. They were then changed by upper echelons within the Luftwaffe, and of course they had to pass the Hitler test. And no aircraft passed the Hitler test without being significantly modified. The Me-262 is no exception.
After Professor Messerschmitt tells Hitler that the aircraft can carry up to 1,000 kilograms of bombs, Field Marshal Milch, in a fit of rage, tells the Führer that even the smallest infant can see that the 262 is a fighter, not a bomber. After months of wavering, the plane goes ahead as a fighter-bomber, taking the sting out of what could have been a ferocious punch. They may possess this wonder weapon, but have few men that can fly it. This becomes the Luftwaffe's final failure, its pilots' lack of training. During its heyday, Germany's finest were given approximately 250 hours of flight time before being sent out to face their enemy, considerably more than the British. And with the Second World War going exceedingly well during 1940 and 1941, the Luftwaffe arrogantly minimizes its training program, figuring that the war will soon be over. By 1942, as the tide begins turning, German pilots are given less than 200 hours of practice flying, while Allied pilots are given over 300. With the war turning against them, shortcuts are made to churn out every single pilot possible. Despite this augmentation, by 1944 the average training time drops to just under 100 hours. In some cases, just a quarter of what P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt pilots were given. With air superiority lost over German soil, it becomes a turkey shoot for American and British aviators as they begin gunning down Me-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s with ease.
At D-Day, in the final planning, the head of Allied tactical aviation was asked, well, what are we going to do about the German fighters? He said there aren't going to be any German fighters over the landing beaches. And he was essentially right, because they'd been wiped out by then.
The decision not to build a pilot training infrastructure like its enemies causes the Luftwaffe to run desperately short on experienced men. So by the time planes like the Me-262, the Arado 234 jet bomber, the Me-163, a rocket-powered interceptor, the Dornier 335 Arrow, the fastest piston-engine plane of the Second World War, and all the other revolutionary aircraft that could have been the difference maker on both fronts, it is a case of too little, too late. The defeat of the Luftwaffe can be attributed to its lack of direction. With the war going in Germany's favor, Hitler, Goering, and Udet were blinded by a false optimism. The tactical war doctrine that they favored initially was being replaced by a long, drawn-out strategic war that they were ill-prepared for. The arrogant nature in which they brushed off the industrial power of the United States and the Soviet Union. The mismanagement of their own country's aircraft industry on a grand scale, and the lack of infrastructure, production, and training during the Second World War's most decisive years would cause the Luftwaffe to write its own epitaph.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks' Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.